Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're exploring the incredible, invisible broadcast network that's operating inside you right this very second. We're talking about the endocrine system. You can think of it as your body's ultimate, highly sophisticated postal service. While you're just going about your day, millions of tiny chemical letters are being dropped into your bloodstream, traveling to very specific addresses, and delivering the critical instructions that keep you alive, balanced, and functioning. It's a brilliant, intricate system, and today we're going to unpack exactly how it all works.
All right, let's dive right in. Our roadmap today covers 4 quick stops. First, the body's communication network. Second, the 3 classes of hormones. Third, how those hormones actually trigger action. And finally, the master control center that directs the whole shebang.
So, kicking things off with Section 1, the body's communication network. This is the network of glands and cells whose entire job is to secrete hormones to maintain homeostasis, that absolutely crucial internal state of balance. To really appreciate what the endocrine system does, it kind of helps to compare it to the body's other major network, the nervous system. You can think of the nervous system as an instant messaging app. It uses both electrical and chemical signals to react and stop almost instantly, targeting very specific spots. But the endocrine system? It's chemical only. It relies on hormones pumped from ductless glands straight into your blood. And because these chemical messengers travel anywhere the blood flows, the endocrine system is a bit slower to act and slower to stop, but man, it can have some incredibly widespread, long-lasting effects. Now, let's look at the different delivery routes these signals can take. Starting with the most localized, we've got autocrine signals. These are released by a cell, and they basically just turn right around and bind to receptors on that exact same cell type. Then you have paracrine signals. These are released by a cell to affect other cell types nearby, basically just chatting with the neighbors. And finally, at the top, we have the star of our show, endocrine signals. These get secreted directly into the circulating blood to influence cells at entirely different, distant locations in your body. All right, now that we understand the delivery routes, let's move on to Section 2 and look at the envelopes themselves. What are these hormones actually made of? There are 3 main structural classes of hormones, and as we'll see, their chemical makeup literally dictates everything about how they work. First up, proteins and polypeptides. These are the larger molecules, including hormones like insulin from the pancreas or the ones secreted by your pituitary gland. Second, we have steroids. These are lipid-based. Think cortisol from the adrenal cortex or estrogen and testosterone from the ovaries and testes. And finally, the third class, derivatives of a specific amino acid called tyrosine. This group gives us things like thyroxine from the thyroid and epinephrine. Here's the really crucial point, though. A hormone's structure totally determines how it travels through your bloodstream. Water-soluble hormones, like our peptide friends, dissolve super easily in blood plasma. They essentially float freely from where they're made right to their target tissue. But steroid and thyroid hormones? Totally different story. Because they're lipid-based, they don't dissolve well in water at all. So they circulate in the blood mostly bound to plasma proteins, which act like specialized little transport vehicles. In fact, usually less than 10% of those steroid or thyroid hormones are just floating free in solution. Okay, we know how they're made and how they travel. That brings us to Section 3, how hormones trigger action. Once a hormone finally arrives at a distant organ, how does that floating chemical actually get read to cause a response? Well, it all comes down to one of the absolute most important concepts in endocrinology, receptor specificity. A hormone might travel everywhere the blood goes, sure, but a cell is only going to respond if it has the exact proper receptor for that message. The shape and the chemical traits of a receptor site act like a super secure lock, only letting specific, perfectly compatible hormones bind to it. It's literally a lock and key mechanism. A given hormone has to fit the receptor perfectly. Take the insulin key, for instance. It only fits the insulin receptor lock. It completely ignores all other receptor types. All those other hormone molecules just floating by in the bloodstream? If they don't fit the specific receptor, the cell remains completely unaffected by them. So what actually happens once the key fits the lock? Well, that takes us right back to our hormone classes. For hydrophilic or water-soluble peptide hormones, they can't easily slip through a cell's fatty membrane, so they bind to receptors right on the outside surface. The hormone acts as a first messenger. When it binds, it activates an enzyme in the membrane, which then creates a second messenger inside the cell, often something called cyclic AMP or CAMP. This CAMP sets off a massive chain reaction, activating proteins that rapidly trigger the cell's physiological response. It's kind of like knocking on the front door and handing a message to someone inside to do the heavy lifting. But contrast that with our hydrophobic steroid hormones. Because they're lipid-soluble, they don't even bother knocking. They just walk right through the target cell's membrane. Once inside, they bind to an internal receptor linked to the cell's DNA. This activated complex directly tweaks gene expression, causing specific genes to be transcribed into mRNA, which then builds new proteins to change what the cell is doing. It's a much more direct, but generally way slower, process than the whole second messenger system. We've covered a ton of ground at the microscopic level with locks, keys, and DNA. Let's zoom back out for section 4, the master control center. We've got all these glands releasing all these chemicals, keeping us in perfect balance. But it really begs the question, who's actually in charge here? Who's the central command directing this massive postal service? The answer is tucked away in a tiny, 1 centimeter, half a gram gland sitting at the base of your brain, the pituitary gland. It's connected right to the hypothalamus by the pituitary stalk. But what's absolutely wild about the pituitary is that it's essentially 2 completely different glands mashed together. You have an anterior and a posterior portion, and they come from entirely different embryonic sources. The anterior pituitary develops from Rathke's pouch, which is an embryonic tissue from the pharynx, while the posterior pituitary is actually an outgrowth of neural tissue straight from the hypothalamus. Because of these different origin stories, the hypothalamus controls the 2 halves in totally different ways. For the anterior pituitary, the hypothalamus runs its own miniature internal postal service. First, it secretes specific releasing or inhibitory hormones. Then, these specialized hormones travel down through microscopic blood vessels called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal vessels. Finally, when they arrive, they either tell the anterior pituitary to release its own massive suite of hormones, like growth hormone or thyroid-stimulating hormone, or they tell it to stop. Now, what's super interesting is how the posterior pituitary operates. Since it developed from neural tissue, there are no portal blood vessels controlling it. Nope. Instead, the cell bodies of the neurons that secrete posterior pituitary hormones are located all the way up in the hypothalamus. Secretion here is controlled by direct nerve signals that shoot down the axons and terminate in the posterior pituitary, dropping hormones straight in your circulatory system. When this master control center is humming along perfectly, our bodies are in total harmony. But what happens when the command chain breaks down? One scenario is hypopituitarism. This can happen if the pituitary stalk gets damaged or from benign tumors called adenomas. If the anterior pituitary can't get those releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, or if the gland itself is damaged, you get a cascading failure. You lose vital downstream hormones like TSH for your thyroid or ACTH for your adrenal cortex.
And on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we have hyperpituitarism. This usually happens when rogue adenomatous tissue just starts pumping out hormones nonstop. It secretes hormones completely without regard to the body's actual needs, blowing right past the natural negative feedback loops that are supposed to keep things in check. We see this a lot with dangerous oversecretion of things like growth hormone or prolactin.
We've seen how these chemical messages travel, how they unlock cellular responses, and how beautifully the hypothalamus and pituitary orchestrate the whole symphony. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this to ponder. If our bodies rely so heavily on such a fragile, precise chemical balance every single second, what incredible microscopic messages are being delivered inside you right now just to process the sound of my voice? The precision of the endocrine system is literally miraculous. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer and keep asking questions.